Welcome back to Econline, everyone. This lesson is a basic introduction to market failure. So we're going to look at why markets fail, what the consequences are, and then we'll start looking into some of the ways we can deal with that later on in the unit. So this is our starting point. We have looked early on and we've spent our entire course looking at free and competitive markets so far. We've kind of made an assumption that the markets are competitive and free with some very limited exceptions. Well, this is what a market needs in order to be competitive. First and foremost, there has to be adequate competition. We need that many buyers and sellers to make sure that they're keeping the market competitive and so on. They need to have good information, resources need to move, and prices have to cover costs and leave some profit for entrepreneurs. If a market doesn't provide all of these things, then it's going to fail and we're not going to get the kinds of output or outcomes that we're looking for. So let's look at some of these questions or reasons that markets fail and more. So our first one is inadequate competition. So as you know, when we have monopolies and so on, we have inefficient use of resources. There's waste. There's higher prices with less output and so on. And it should be remarked here that we need competition on both sides. It's not enough to just have a competitive product market. You also need to have a competitive resource market on the other side of that. Those things keep prices down and they keep output up. That's true for both the product and the factor market. Also, when consumers don't have access to adequate information, markets fail. I'll give you a very simple example. Suppose you were in the market to buy a car, and you went down to a car dealership, and they had a price tag on a car of $20,000. If you were not aware that there was a car down the street, or the exact same car was being sold down the street for $16,000, you might end up paying a price that's significantly above the market price. So buyers and sellers have to have access to information in order for markets to function effectively. It's important that resources can move between markets. You think of markets where resources are fixed or they stay in one place, or the labor or whatever, for whatever the reason is, we can't get resources to move out of one market and into another. It's not always necessarily a physical movement here that we're necessarily talking about. Sometimes resources get trapped in a given industry. A great example of this, and one we've looked at as we've discussed some imperfectly competitive markets, would be something like an airport. It takes a long time, or I should say an airline. It's a lot of resources, a lot of time, and all kinds of stuff that goes into an organization as immensely complicated as a major airline. So all of the resources that are being taken up by that airline are largely locked in that place. And even if the airline becomes unprofitable or less profitable, there are issues in that market, because it's so big and cumbersome and less likely to change quickly, those resources could be trapped in that industry. So we want to do whatever we can to make sure that resources can move freely in and out of different markets so they can go to where they're going to be most efficiently used. This brings us to a topic called externalities. Now, externalities are the unintended side effects when two people engage or two parties engage in a transaction. So we assume that when two parties engage in a transaction, they do so for mutually beneficial reasons. They both find that they get something out of it. But sometimes we find that other people transactions. So, for example, we have people who will be incurring costs or receiving benefits that they really had nothing to do with. So let's take a look at some of these, or some of the basics here. A positive externality is when you have two people who engage in a transaction, and as a result of that transaction, somebody else is affected in a positive way. For example, if an individual starts a business to sell products to another person, they obviously are benefiting from that, as are the other person, but the unintended side effect of that is that, for example, other people will be hired by that business, competitiveness in the labor market goes up, and so on. Another example would be vaccinations. The more people are vaccinated against the disease, the less likely the people who are not vaccinated are to get that disease. So if everybody but you is vaccinated, you're probably not going to get sick. Final example of this would be, education. We all benefit from living in an educated society. Now, this is not necessarily because educated people can find jobs and so on. When that kind of vocational education is paid for via the price that they charge in the market for their services. But we all benefit from education in a very general way because we live in a literate society, which allows us to have a voting population, elections, and so on. So that each person is able to read has a positive effect on you, even though you may have had nothing to do with them learning how to read. Negative externalities are usually a little easier for students to understand. This is when two people are doing something that they both enjoy or that's going to provide benefit to the two of them, but it hurts somebody else. So if I take my very young child out to a restaurant, he screams the entire time. I'm still getting the dinner, the restaurant is still getting the money for my meal, but all of the other people in the restaurant have now had to pay a cost. They enjoyed their meal a little bit less because of the screaming child. So that's a negative externality. Sometimes the costs that we impose on people are in monetary terms and can be measured, and sometimes they're a little bit harder to measure, such as the example I just gave of the crying baby. It'd be difficult to figure out how much money my wife and I owe each of these people. Public goods are goods that really can't be used or can't be provided by the private market. And without getting too in depth here, because we'll get to them more in depth in another lesson, public goods, number one, are shareable. They have shared consumption, meaning that when one person uses it, it doesn't hurt another person or diminish another person's use of this. So, for example, when the military protects the borders and that makes me safe, you are not less safe as a result. We're both equally safe. Another part of this is called excludability. Can we exclude somebody from using the product? So, for example, sticking with national defense, if an individual decides not to pay his or her taxes, he or she, provided they still live within the borders, is still protected by our military. So a good that is shared consumption, meaning that we can all use it without preventing other people from using it, and is non-excludable, meaning that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop the people who don't pay from getting the good, then we would call it a public good. And in most cases, the public sector, the government, provides the public good because private markets will not. When there are public goods provided, and then we have something called free riders. Free riders are people who get the benefit without paying. So a good example, again, would be that person who does not get vaccinated. They still are benefiting in the sense that they're less likely to get the disease while everyone else will. Another example of a free rider is when you go to a park or use the facilities in another town that you don't live within. You haven't paid the taxes for those. The people who reside in that town have paid the taxes, for example, to erect that park, but we can go and use it freely. Free riders can be a problem in many industries, but it usually just depends on which one we're looking at. Free riders are not necessarily a major issue in terms of how we'll look at the market failure issue going forward, but it is something worth pointing out. All right, make sure you check out the next lesson that gets more specifics on externalities and in particular how we graph them and how we connect them or correct them.